Good afternoon. I'm Carol Horn-Penn, and I think maybe we'll start our afternoon session. For those of you who are on the call and not speaking, if you could mute your speaker or your audio, that would be great. And then it'll be my pleasure to get us started. I'm Carol Horn-Penn from Clements Construction Company, and I am the current president of Crew Greater Philadelphia. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion today of the Crew 2020 benchmark study, which focuses on gender and diversity in commercial real estate. As we'll elaborate this afternoon, the study is a wake-up call and a call to action for why the commercial real estate industry really should pay attention to the question, who are we and where are we in our collective efforts to achieve parity in our industry? Crew Greater Philadelphia includes over 160 members. They, along with our sponsors, are the backbone of our chapter. As reflected in the foreground, in the slide, we have 35 sponsors, organizations, and Crew Greater Philadelphia is extremely grateful for their unwavering support, especially in 2020 and expectedly in 2021. Donald Alpone, Crew Greater Philadelphia at-large board member and our chapter champion co-chair, will share a bit about Crew Network Foundation, and then we'll proceed to our discussion. Donna?
Morning. Crew Network Foundation funds 4 specific areas that directly support the advancement of women in commercial real estate globally. These areas are crucial to building a pipeline of women coming into the industry and supporting and advancing them throughout their careers. Our foundation college scholarships support future female leaders as they pursue university-level education that will lead to careers in commercial real estate. Scholars receive $5,000 scholarship, paid summer internship, Crew Network student membership, and convention registration. To date, Network has awarded 171 scholarships to college women, totaling over $1 million. And this year's scholarship applications are now being accepted through April the 15th. Thanks to the support of the foundation, Crew Network is the world's leading producer of research on gender and diversity in commercial real estate. We are the sole organization tracking data and statistics to elevate discussion and provide insights and improving gender equity and diversity in our industry. They've provided the white paper behind today's programming. And finally, Crew Careers and U-Crew. These programs are the key way that we're building a pipeline of women. They are mission specific to what we stand for, and there's really no better way to educate students, faculty, and other educators about opportunities in commercial real estate. Next slide, please. This year, as part of the Future is Female campaign, we have the ability to donate in honor of fellow members. All donations to the Future is Female campaign will go toward the foundation's $20,000 campaign goal. We hope we can count on all of you to support the foundation's mission by making an individual discretionary donation. And I'm going to pass it back to Carol to start the program.
Thank you, Donna. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Gina Lavery, our Crew Greater Philadelphia member, and Cecilia Heon from the Ohio Crew chapter. Gina is a Senior Vice President and Principal at eConsult Solutions here in Philadelphia. She leads the firm's economic development practice area and also is involved in eConsult's real estate and urban planning practices. Gina develops economic and fiscal impact studies, provides advisory services on incentive programs and public financing, and supplies market insights for clients making real estate decisions. She's a member, as I said, of Crew Greater Philadelphia, and she also served on the 2020 Crew Network Industry Research Committee that produced this study. Cecilia is a partner with the property tax law firm of Siegel Jennings in Ohio, in Cleveland, Ohio. Her practice is focused on real estate tax assessment in Ohio, and in that role, she reviews property tax values, assesses tax appeal strategies, defends against tax assessments, and evaluates potential property tax implications. She's written several articles on state and local taxation issues. Cecilia is a past president of the CRU Cleveland chapter, and she served as the co-chair of the study that we will be discussing, of the committee that wrote the study that we're discussing today. So it is my pleasure to turn our program over to Gina and to Cecilia. And thank you very much for your time and effort and commitment to doing this work on behalf of CRU Network, CRU in general, and sharing the paper with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all for being here today. I'm grateful to be here with Gina to share some important research on gender and diversity in the commercial real estate industry with you. As Carol mentioned, Gina and I were both on the 2020 CRU Network Industry Research Committee, which helped work on this report. I think there are two broad overarching takeaways from this research. One is that progress, unfortunately, has been slower than we'd like. The data is perhaps not as encouraging as we like it to be at this point. And as Carol mentioned in her introduction, it also secondly serves as a real call to action. I think the data in this report is a real opportunity for us as individuals and as an industry to recommit to advancing greater pay parity and diversity of all kinds in commercial real estate. So I'd like to start with a brief overview of the study, and then we're going to talk in more depth in three specific areas. The first is the ever-present compensation gap. The second, we'll talk a little more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the industry. And then we'll talk about career aspiration and career satisfaction. So for those of you who don't know, CRU Network is a 12,000 plus member global multidisciplinary commercial real estate business network. Every 5 years, it conducts a benchmark study to measure progress for women in the industry. And for the first time in 2020, it also asked questions to specifically benchmark diversity in the commercial real estate industry. Next slide, please. This project was made possible with the support of the underwriters shown here. If you're a member of any of these organizations, thank you again for your continued support of CRU Network's mission and this important research. CRU Network enlisted the MIT Center for Real Estate as its independent research partner to help survey, tabulate, analyze, and produce the 2020 study. Just an important note about the data, all the participant responses and marking conditions should be taken to be pre-COVID-19. In addition to CRU Network, 8 commercial real estate associations also partnered with CRU Network to distribute the study to their members and their constituents. In addition to CRU, that included ICSC, NAIOP, IREM, ULI, and SIOR. Next slide, please. So starting with a brief overview of the study, the 2020 study posed the same questions from the previous studies, and then it introduced 8 new questions to examine diversity and workplace culture. And then for the first time in 2020, it also asked questions to garner area-specific data for Canada, the United Kingdom, and the US. And because CRU Network is a global network, we had respondents from all over the world, including places like Brazil and India. And just under a total of 3,000 respondents participated, which was an increase from the prior year. The 2020 report summarizes key findings from all four CRU Network benchmark studies, and then it also provides new insight into other aspects of the industry. So as I said, a total of 2,930 commercial real estate professionals participated in the 2020 study. That was a 34% increase from the prior study in 2015. Of those respondents, 82.4% identified as women, 17.5% identified as men, 13% identified as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, And then 3.3 identified as LGBTQIA+, which includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer questioning, intersex, or asexual. We also looked at some of the local Philadelphia data, and out of the local market, there were 66 total participants. Out of that 66, 55 or 83% identified as women, 11 or 17% identified as men, mirroring the overall study. And then 11% of the Philadelphia area respondents identified as Black, Indigenous, people of color, or otherwise diverse. The Philadelphia respondents had the following age breakdown. 27% were less than 40 years old. 24% were between the ages of 40 and 49. And then 48% identified themselves as 50 years or older. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gina to talk a little bit more about our first area, the compensation gap.
Thanks, Cecilia. Yeah, so as she just mentioned, I'll start by talking about compensation, which we've broken into two overarching categories, base and bonus/commission pay. So moving on to the next slide, commission, consistent with the last three studies, the 2020 study finds a substantial compensation gap between women and men. Overall, the difference in total average earnings, which includes salaries, bonuses, and commission combined, is 34%, a nearly 11% increase in the gap from 2015. The pay gap starts at entry level, so about 9%, and in 2015, it was just 2% gap. The gap widens as respondents move up the ladder. So in previous studies, the gap is the widest at the C-suite at 33%, and that's a 3% increase from 2015. Interestingly, at the senior levels, these gaps are primarily due to bonus and commissions. Again, as we've kind of mentioned this throughout the presentation, all of these statistics are pre-pandemic. So we realize that anything that we're seeing here, the trends could be kind of exaggerated in the last year. So moving on to the next slide, we're looking at the base salary here, and you can see the breakdown across industry sectors. The chart shows the distribution across specializations, and then you can see the total of all real estate sectors on the right-hand side. These findings are for all survey participants. The base salary gap between men and women is around 10%, which means that on average, women make 90 cents for every dollar that men earn in fixed salaries. For Black, Asian, and Hispanic Latinx women, the salary gap is wider. Black women make 85 cents, Asian women make 86 cents, and Hispanic Latinx women are making 80 cents for every dollar that men earn. Those statistics are all for the global survey that took place. Looking at Philadelphia respondent data specifically, the results are slightly different, and we'll explain why. So women's average compensation, so the women who took this survey that live in Philadelphia or the Philadelphia area, their average salary was around $125,000, while men's average salary compensation was around $88,000. So that sounds a little different than the trends that we're talking about at the national level. I don't think that we should see that and conclude that Philadelphia real estate has conquered the pay gap challenge. This could really just be, this is most likely tied to the relative age and experience of Philadelphia respondents. And given that the sample size is so small, if the men that responded are more junior in their careers, that would skew the data and the results that we're seeing here. But let's take a look at the next slide, which talks about the gap in bonus and commission. So first, when you look at commission and bonuses, the gender gap is much larger across all sectors. On average, women earn 56% less than men from commissions and bonuses. It's a ton. White women earn 51% less from commission and bonuses than men, while Black women earn 71% less, Asian women earn 73% less, and Hispanic Latinx women earn 74% less than their male counterparts. In Philadelphia, the dynamics are consistent with the national study. So in Philly, women's average bonus and commission was around $77,000, according to the survey. Men averaged $187,000 in bonus and commission. So that disparity is around 59% less for women than men in the Philadelphia region. And while the gaps are similar across specializations, you'll see the difference in absolute terms is particularly stark in brokerage, as you can see in the slide. Because the gap was so startling, Crew Network consulted some other external sources to explore what's going on here. A 2019 study on pay conducted by ADP Research Institute tracked 11,000 professionals over 6 years and found that the average bonus for women was less than 2/3 the bonus given to men of comparable base salary, age, and tenure. And that's consistent across all ages, salaries, and industry groups. Crew research has shown several dynamics that could lead to disparities in commission earnings. Women are historically underrepresented in brokerage. Some factors may be related to gender bias in hiring or disparities in commission sharing arrangements. Women may not be getting access to high-profile clients or the most profitable projects and deals. So that's one of the reasons why networks like Crew are so important in helping educate about these differences, compensation packages, and negotiation strategies to help us reach parity with men. So moving on to the next slide, as you can see, commissions represent the highest earning potential for commercial real estate professionals, and women are not accessing those opportunities nearly as much as men. Fewer women than men reported that they would be willing to accept positions that include commission as part of their compensation. We do see, however, that the percentage of both men and women willing to take on commission-based work has decreased from 2015. Only 8% of men and 4% of women are interested in that type of work. I'll turn it back over to Cecilia to talk a little bit more about the diversity and inclusion component of the study.
Thanks, Gina. Next slide, please. So again, for the first time in 2020, Crew Network asked questions to benchmark diversity in the commercial real estate in addition to gender. And overall, this is probably not surprising to anyone here, commercial real estate professionals report that they don't work in very diverse environments. And that was defined as a workplace where 25% or more of the employees are Black, Indigenous, people of color. In the study, only 16% reported that they worked in those types of environments. When we looked at the local Philadelphia respondents, 11% of the respondents identified as Black, Indigenous, people of color, or otherwise diverse. And that compares to 13% of the total respondents who identified as Black, Indigenous, people of color, or otherwise diverse. Next slide, please. So again, for the first time in 2020, Crew Network was able to garner some area-specific data for the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. And you can see some global comparisons on diversity here. And as you can see by the chart, workplaces in Canada are reported to be more diverse than either the United States or the United Kingdom. In Canada, the respondents, 26% reported that they worked in very diverse work environments, while 33% reported they work in somewhat diverse environments. Next slide, please. So out of the total industry, about 36.7% of commercial real estate professionals are women. You can see the breakdown over the three areas there. Over time, the percentage of women in commercial real estate has remained pretty consistent between 35 to 37%. Overall, in the 2020 study, the women respondents tended to be younger than the men and younger generally. In 2005 and 2015, the number of respondents who reported being 39 years old or younger was about 33%. And in 2020, that had risen to about 38.5%. So this may signal that a new generation of women are entering the commercial real estate in the last 5 to 10 years. It suggests that there may be improvement in the entry-level pipeline to programs like UCrew and Crew Careers and the education and sponsorships of the Network Foundation that Donna mentioned earlier. Although there does appear to be improvement in the entry-level pipeline, again, the overall percentage has remained pretty constant. So that shows that we still have challenges related to retention and attrition. Brokerage overall has had the lowest percentage of women in each study, although the percentage has increased since 2010. Could you go back to the last slide, please? Thank you. And you can see the breakdown per specialization there. Even though it still has the lowest percentage, it did increase in the 2020 study from the prior year. More women occupy brokerage positions than ever before at 29%. And that was a 6% increase from the prior benchmark study. So that's another positive data point from the 2020 study. And although all the study data is pre-COVID, we want to just take a moment here to note the disproportionate effect that the pandemic has had on women in the workforce. There was a Forbes article in late 2020 that reported that 865 women had left the workforce in September, and that was according to US Labor Department statistics. And that was 4 times the number of men who had left the workforce in that same time period. During that same time period, 1 in 4 women who were still in the workforce were considering reducing hours, switching to a part-time schedule, taking a leave of absence, or leaving the workforce altogether. And then in January of 2021, 275 women left the US workforce compared to 71,000 men. And so that was just under 4 times the amount. The National Women's Law Center reported that since February of 2020, women have lost over 5.4 million jobs. And this has accounted for 55% of the overall net job loss since the beginning of the health crisis. The reasons for this disproportionate impact obviously are multiple and complex, but there are sort of 2 overlapping facets that come out as you look at the research. First is that a lot of the the industries that were hardest hit by COVID, there is a higher representation of women in those industries. And then second, in addition to the jobs themselves, the industries being hit and the jobs disappearing, women's support systems largely evaporated with schools, childcare centers being closed. And as we know, women still tend to be the primary caregivers in a lot of families, and so this impacted them pretty severely. We don't know yet how this will all play out, but certainly it's going to have a long-term effect on the commercial real estate industry as a whole. Next slide, please. Again, for the first time in 2020, the study asked respondents if they had ever been exposed to conversations or behavior that could be construed as offensive or sexist in the workplace. And women were much more likely than men to report that they had had this experience in the last year, 45% of women versus 20% of men. And then 7% of women and 3% of men reported being sexually harassed at least once in the past year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, only 16% of the respondents reported that they've worked in a very diverse workplace where 25% or more of the professionals were Black, Indigenous, people of color. However, more than half the respondents reported that they had noticed a culture shift. So another positive data point coming out of this study. The changes around the culture shift around diversity, equity, and inclusion were reflected in things like policies that were more supportive of work-life balance, policies that were more supportive of family leave, maybe more flexible hours, training in bias awareness, and other types of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Interestingly, the reported changes in culture did not really have too much impact on pay equity, as reported by the respondents. And just speaking to my own personal experience, when I started getting more involved with Crew Network and attending more network events, I noticed that attendees did not appear to be especially diverse, at least in race. But I have noticed in the last couple of years that both attendees and speakers do appear to reflect more diversity, not just in race, but age and experience, industry specialization, geography, which I think all strengthens our network and leads to greater equity and inclusion in the industry. Another thing that these drivers of workplace culture shift show, I think, is that there isn't one overwhelming thing that is leading or kind of pushing the change. So it looks like lasting change is going to require grappling with these issues on multiple fronts. So you will need, top-down leadership. You might have pressure from outside clients and partners who are prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. You may have pressure from inside the organizations, from staff wanting change, and it's going to become more important, I think, in attracting and retaining talent. And I'm going to turn it over to Gina now again to take us through our last area of discussion.
Thanks, Cecilia. So yeah, I'll share some high-level findings about women's career aspirations and satisfaction from the benchmark study. As we've already mentioned, the survey was pre-COVID, and again, I think these, you'll see that these findings will only be more exaggerated now. In 2015, Crew Network began asking respondents to identify the highest level that they aspire to reach in their careers. So the results indicated that men, much more than women, aspire to reach the C-suite, 40% of men and 28% of women. The 2020 study still shows a gap, but the percentage of women who aim for the C-suite has increased to 32%. Notably, women under 40 were more likely than women over 40 to say that they aspire to reach the C-suite level in their careers. Crew Network published a follow-up white paper in 2016 that included interviews with 1,000 CRE professionals, both men and women, to understand the underlying factors in this disparity. The two factors respondents identified the most often as reasons for the underrepresentation of women in the C-suite were first, just a general lack of support for women in the C-suite, and two, a belief that being in the C-suite would adversely affect women's commitments and responsibilities outside of work. So moving on to success and compensation. Women's career satisfaction and perceptions of success decreased across all industry specializations in 2020, while men's career satisfaction and perception of success has continued to increase since 2010. Of course, in the last year, I would imagine that women may have, their satisfaction may have decreased further, men, not sure. There could be several reasons for this decrease, though. Women receive lower pay overall, as we've discussed, and likely have fewer opportunities for upward mobility and less access to leadership roles than their male counterparts. Women could be growing increasingly frustrated, being unable to reap the financial benefits of the commercial real estate industry as fully as men. So the lack of progress as reflected in this study, despite our individual and collective efforts to address gender biases, could also be taking a toll, as well as an increased awareness about the persistent disparities and challenges that women face in the industry. Unfortunately, this trend, may continue to be a setback in the short term. Cecilia mentioned some statistics earlier about the differences between men and women leaving the workforce during the pandemic. The impact of that departure from the workforce, just in general dollars, is actually astounding. A recent Harvard Business Review article that just came out a couple of weeks ago, while not focused solely on commercial real estate, I estimated that the global GDP growth could be $1 trillion lower in 2030 just because of the difference between women's unemployment rate and men's. So if women were simply at the same unemployment rate as men, as we recover from COVID, that's $1 trillion additional dollars in the global economy. Moving on to work-life balance. So it's an important factor for both men and women, according to the survey findings. While women's satisfaction with work-life balance increased only slightly last year, this was pre-COVID, men have become more likely to report being very satisfied with their work-life balance over the last three benchmark studies. Again, the pandemic has likely impacted these trends. I found a recent study completed by Deloitte that found that nearly 7 out of 10 women experienced negative shifts in their routine as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. I feel good, I feel happy for the 3 out of those 10 that haven't experienced any negative shifts. These women surveyed have also acknowledged a slowdown in their career progression. 65% of women reported more household chores, 58% added childcare responsibilities, including homeschooling, and a third still reported that they had an increased workload as the pandemic has continued. So, work-life balance is certainly an issue that we continue to need to address. So women are more likely than men to report that their compensation or career advancement has been adversely affected by their marital status or the need to care for family. These percentages have remained virtually unchanged since 2015. These findings mirror some of the information earlier that we've talked about related to the effects of COVID on women and the rate at which they are exiting the workforce, some permanently. Moving on to the next slide on barriers. So this is a question that we asked about barriers to success in the commercial real estate sector. And this graphic is showing the top 5 barriers that women and men identified both in the 2015 survey and then in the 2020 survey. So the top 5 self-reported barriers to success have not changed for women since 2015, although the ranking of the top 3 has been reshuffled. With the lack of company mentor sponsor dropping down from 1st to 3rd. For men, the lack of promotion opportunities has also risen back up into the top as it was in 2010. We also asked this question around barriers to success for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This, as Cecilia mentioned, this is the 2020 benchmark study is the first time that we ask these additional questions regarding diversity. So we don't have any trend data this year because this is the first time that we're asking that data. Asking those questions. So for people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, they listed the same barriers to success as women overall, with the exception of limited access to decision makers, which was identified as the number 5 barrier for success for their careers. I'll turn the mic back over to Cecilia to talk about diversity a little bit more and wrap things up.
Thanks, Gina. So we just touched on some of the information that's included in the 2020 benchmark study today. It is pretty dense with data, and I would encourage you to go to crewnetwork.org to download or request a copy and take a look at it in more detail. Please share it with your colleagues, leaders, other professional organizations. Just kind of echoing what Gina had mentioned in some of her research, there was a McKinsey and Company report in 2015 that estimated that if women participated equally with men in the economy, and this is overall not just in the commercial real estate industry, that the global GDP would rise by almost 28 trillion within 10 years. And then research by a number of people has shown that the inclusion of people of different genders, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, economic backgrounds is a business advantage. Companies that prioritize diversity, are outperforming others. There's correlations to greater earnings, better governance, greater innovation, and greater attraction and retention of talent. Yet, as we've seen today and through this data, progress has been slow. And to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think leaders and everyone in the industry have to continue to, one, understand the issues that are presented in the benchmark study and really treat dealing with them as a business imperative. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned earlier, I think this survey does serve as a real call to action. And we know that greater diversity, equity, and inclusion does start at the very top. And this slide shows 5 action items for industry and company leaders to help increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in commercial real estate. So first, as we said, top leaders must be invested, involved, measured, and held accountable. We saw that one of the largest drivers of change was direction and prioritization from the leadership. That means, there has to be accountability, there must be resources, there has to be a budget. Second, you could hire an external consultant to help you recognize gaps, barriers, unconscious and implicit bias, take action to overcome it, and put accountability measures in place, to communicate policies and expectations clearly, as well as incentivize and prioritize greater DEI. And then third, you can conduct pay equity tests regularly. And it's important not to just look at base salary. As we've seen, the starkest gaps are in the bonus and commission pay. And it's easy sometimes to miss that because they may come from different area of your budget. They may be more seasonal. It's not as easy to just pull out that base salary number from HR records. So it's really important to include the bonus and commission portion as well, where the greatest disparities exist. Fourth, focus on intentionally recruiting a diverse workforce, partner with universities and organizations to seek out diverse talent. And then last, you can partner with Crew Network to help advance the industry to be more equitable for all. Moving on to the next slide. You can also share the study with your company leaders, your heads of human resources, employees, professional associations. You can download the study or request copies at crewnetwork.org. You can attend the Crew Greater Philadelphia's April event, professional development program, which will include tools to affect change based on some of these findings. Before we get to the questions, I'll turn it over to Kathy Fay to tell us a little more about the Crew Greater Philadelphia's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advocacy Group.
Hi, thanks, Cecilia. Good afternoon. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We just wanted to, as a group, let you know, our members and others that are attending today, that Crew Philadelphia has formed a diversity, equity, inclusion advocacy group to, well, actually, and myself and Lisa Drake from Berkadia are both heading up this effort. And if you could go to the next slide, thank you. So a lot of times, diversity, equity, inclusion has been brought up as a topic over the past year or two, I would say, that has become the forefront for many of us. So I'm not going to read this whole definition to you, but these definitions we put on this slide were taken from Crew Network and the national group that got together, I believe it was formed last year, to take care in putting diversity, equity, inclusion as a top priority for Network. If you go to the next slide. So here in Philadelphia, what we are going to do as part of our group, and we have about, I'm going to say 12 or so people who have volunteered, again, from the general membership. If you didn't see that call to action, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Lisa and let us know you're interested in working with us. But we are going to be assessing as a chapter where we are on the DEI initiatives, creating an action plan for the chapter regarding DEI, and putting policies into place so that we have DEI embedded in our chapter as a part of who we are as an organization, that it's not going to be some flash in the pan type of a thing, but something we have already started actually working on last year in a lot of our programming, and we are going to continue doing that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Cecilia and Lisa. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I put a little, not that you guys can access it, so maybe we can put that, Kristen, if you wouldn't mind, maybe putting that link into the chat, but that's a direct link for members. You can access the download right there to all of the DEI resource library and see the many items that network has in place for us as members. And I'm going to turn that back over for a few questions to Cecilia and to Gina. Thank you guys both.
Thanks, Kathy. It looks like we've got some questions here. So let's see. What research is being conducted to capture the data directly associated with COVID? Seems awareness has increased since the last study, yet the numbers have not improved. What do we attribute that to? So I know Crew Network specifically is going to look at some of the COVID related data for their next benchmark study. I don't know that they've started capturing any of that research yet, but they definitely have it to look into for the next time the benchmark study is produced.
And I'll just add to that. I think, Donna, that was your question. I think that in general, that the kind of impacts of COVID are going to be widely studied, both, in terms of disparities between men and women, but across different types of jobs and sectors. I know that, Crew Network's already focusing on that. To your question about like what can we attribute the lack of change from the last study, I guess, Cecilia, were you, I know you've been involved in Crew Network's industry research committee for a couple of years. Do you have any kind of sense of why there's been no kind of shift in the positive direction?
I was involved in the industry research committee for a couple of years, but not unfortunately at the time that the benchmark study was compiled and produced. I think a lot of it might be what they've mentioned in the body of the report, just that, it's slow and it's hard to sustain momentum, I think, for, people tend to get discouraged because it feels like progress should be maybe a little further along. And I'm hopeful that they'll include some of that in the next study, along with the COVID data in terms of, why has progress been so slow?
I'll just add, this is, not necessarily based in the study, but I do see, like, with the move towards an increased focus on diversity and inclusion, I'm hopeful that in the next 5 years that we'll see some improvement. I think the biggest, a big discouraging factor for women is just not seeing more people like that, like women who have similar kind of experiences in their shoes. So the more that we can kind of have diverse faces within the industry and opportunities for mentorship, I think that will help kind of retain the kind of cohort that are kind of starting at entry level right now.
Yeah, and I think that's why the data too is so important, because it's, easy to kind of know or think anecdotally, oh yeah, there's a pay gap, but then when you see the actual numbers, oh, it's 56%, that's a startling whole other thing. So I think continued research like this will be important in kind of hopefully pushing that along a little more.
Looking through the other questions. So Suzanne Hansen asked, I'd love suggestions on how to make senior leaders aware there is even an issue. There seems to be resistance to admitting they can do better diplomatically, of course. I don't know if that's a question as much as like a general, like some food for thought.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to deal with the implicit bias part for sure, because people, I think, it's a hard topic to grapple with anyway, and I think people do sometimes get defensive. I think that this isn't available to everyone, but I think in that way, hiring outside experts might be helpful, because then you have like an independent third party who's coming in and kind of has expertise and maybe takes away some of the emotional impact of it. I think education is really important too. I know in the recent Leadership Summit, Crew Network had a program related to implicit bias, and it was, really about not just educating other people, but understanding what your own biases might be. And so I think that's an important piece too, because obviously the more you know about it, the easier it is to kind of deal with it. The network DEI playbook that Kathy mentioned has a lot of good resources. It's written, really as a guide to the chapters, but there's a lot of, there's a library of resources and a lot of suggestions that I think you can use within your own industry firms. It doesn't have to just be chapter specific. And I think, as Gina mentioned, that's why it's so important that the industry itself reflects a diverse pool. I think it's much easier, as people, to understand issues when you have a personal face attached to it. When you know someone who's gone through that experience, it's much easier to understand it and acknowledge it to be a real thing. So I think as we get more, hopefully as diversity initiatives gain more traction, and we do have an industry that's more reflective of the diversity of our society as a whole, hopefully that'll be a result of some of those things, is that people will be able to see more clearly, that some of these issues really do exist.
Thanks for that. And it was really a question because, it's like, well, we're hiring who we can hire. And I do like your suggestions, though, of going to like the Harvard implicit bias stuff and everything, because that would be helpful, I think. So thank you.
So let's see, we've got a question from Carol. What suggestions do you make for smaller companies, less than 100 people, where some of the action items might be challenging because of limited organizational and or administrative resources?
So I'll take a first stab at that. Cecilia, let me know what your thoughts are. That question resonates with me, as I work for a small business as well, and certain steps that are suggested are probably a little challenging from a resource standpoint. I think the biggest one is simply the pipeline of potential of talent into the company, whether that's through interns, entry level people, just to kind of start getting a pipeline of talent. And they might not stay in your company, but they're kind of growing their skill set and kind of and hopefully if they move on, they're moving on to another job in a similar sector and had a good experience with their time kind of at that entry level.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think too, it's easy, I know for me personally, to get overwhelmed that just, oh, there's so much that we need to address or could be addressed or could be improved. And, I definitely struggle with I'm not at a huge firm, so we do have some limits on administrative and organizational resources. And I really try to just, kind of pare it down to something small. So recently we've tried to look at diversity and inclusion in just the recruiting piece, and not just recruiting, but even smaller than that, just in terms of where we're, posting or advertising our jobs. And it's a very small step, but it's one that we're able to do right now. So I think we should try, not to get discouraged by sort of the overall scope, and just really, do what you can, because all of that will add to improvement.
Yeah, that's a great point, Cecilia. We've kind of at eConsult started thinking about that. Like we you know, oh, I'm a graduate from this program, I'm just going to post, you know, the job description there. Well, what about the other kind of, you know, institutions that are nearby that might be have really talented students, but we just didn't even think to post there, just because the easiest thing is for me to go to my alma mater. I think that's a great point.
We have another question, or this is more a statement from Donna. It would be great to learn what other companies are doing to drive DEI initiatives in order to share with all. So if anyone has anything they'd like to share, please speak up, or you could put it in the chat.
Well, I'll say that as suggested, I have taken this DEI playbook that Crew came up with. I know Carol had mentioned this a few sessions ago. Take this, give it to your company. I mean, if there's something that you're looking to improve and work on as a firm, to take it and use it. So I did. I kind of handed that over to my HR people and my marketing person, my CEO, and, you know, kind of saying, let's start talking about this and having conversations. And to the last point, you know, about where to find people that can, you know, that are qualified and have all of the qualities that that are needed and wanted, but can also be diverse. So I love those suggestions about, you know, going to the different universities around here. So yeah, that's how we're using it, starting to use it at any rate.
And I didn't realize, I knew about some of them, but there are a whole array of, you know, job posting sites and advertisement sites that specifically have an outreach to candidates who may not be served by some of the more, you know, mainstream job sites and job boards. And there's a lot of them. So you can, you know, there's one relatively easy thing to do in terms of trying to reach more candidates.
Celia, that kind of a resource, if it's available to be shared, would really, I think, be very helpful, because many of us might not know where that resource is. And having served on Network's DEI task force, that might be something we want to share with the task force so that we can share it with all chapters.
See what, I'll have to dig it out, but yes, certainly I'll get something together and I can email it.
And then Stacy, I see that you have a question, more maybe of a suggestion for a future, for the next benchmark study. Is it possible to break down or split bonus versus commission, either for this study and the next one? And yeah, understood that there's differences in commissions versus bonuses. I'm kind of drawing a blank on the reason that we combine the two. It may have had to do with the sample size. Cecilia, do you remember why those were combined?
I don't off the top of my head, but I suspect it probably is something to do with the size.
Yeah, I just think it would be interesting, again, because commissions, it is pretty cut and dry. You know, as much as you sell, book, lease, that's going to be your commission payout, versus I think a lot of bonuses are just sort of arbitrarily given out. And I think it'd be interesting to see how women are doing, particularly on the arbitrary ones, how they're just being kind of handed out. But then also on the flip side, I think it would be really interesting for women to see in a commission-based industry, maybe they could be doing a little bit better because it is based on performance versus, you know, kind of at discretion of management.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think there's also so many different commission and bonus structures that might be hard to capture. So maybe even trying to capture those different strategies. So some organizations just do a blanket bonus for everyone, irregardless, whereas some do it based on performance and some have commission and some don't. I mean, I just think there's some real distinctions that might be helpful, maybe even drilling into the type of work people are doing, because I think that also makes a difference too.
And I see Jen Baker, I don't know if you're here, you just commented on, in the brokerage world, most people will not tell anyone their commission info, which, what about anonymously in a survey of a couple thousand global participants?
Oh, no. Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, that's really difficult for anybody in the brokerage world to give out any of that information, especially like because there's so limited women in the brokerage world. I mean, there's highly unlikely that they would voluntarily give up their commission earnings, because you would really be able to drill down who it was and how much they were making. So
yeah, maybe that's part of the reason. Good point. Just so everyone knows, the link to the network's DEI playbook and toolkit has been posted in the chat, so you can access it there. As well as a link to the benchmark study itself.
I see one other question from Mava around just in general, has anyone here brought in outside consultants to support implementation of DEI initiatives or targeted support such as implicit bias training? I know, Mava, if you're looking for resources, I have a couple of friends that do this, but I have not participated in one at my company yet.
My old law firm, we had we went down to Atlantic City and had a weekend of DEI sort of training and implicit bias training. I don't remember the consultants that we brought in, but they were fantastic. And they broke out everyone according to sort of level within the firm, if you were in management, and they sort of targeted the training. And we did, some exercises and icebreakers and things, but it was very, very interesting and eye-opening. And I think it's really helpful because sometimes I think when you're not in that position, I don't think it's just hard for people to understand what others are experiencing. And I think those trainings really do help to raise awareness. You can really try to get into someone's shoes and thoughts. And I thought it was wonderful. It was really a wonderful experience. So I can try to find out what the consultants, the company was, and certainly share that. But I thought that was wonderful.
Just
Amy,
as
I think that would be, I would love to hear some of those resources. We're talking about this in our strategic plan, and it is kind of a sensitive topic at times, right? So sometimes I think it's easier to have, somebody from the outside addressing, but there's definitely, awareness at, varying degrees, I would say, in our partnership. So yeah, send me any resources you have if anybody else has had good experiences.
One of the other things I wanted to suggest, that network does have a couple of DEI training sessions that are, one of them actually, unfortunately, was taking place simultaneously with this, but they have been recorded and will be available to you if you're a member for you to view at a later time, and they are free of charge. And they're also putting together a cohort that starts in March, and it meets for 3 different sessions. I believe they're 2 hours each. That is a $250 registration fee, but it might be something and it is done by an outside consultant that Crew Network has hired. So that could be a resource for people as well if you're interested in checking into that.
Amy, are you able to share at all any action items that came out of that consultant experience?
I think so. I attended, I was on the hiring committee for the firm, so I attended that specific session. And I think, a lot of questions that are asked of people in hiring, and, you'd be surprised at some of the things that people think are okay to ask in these hiring situations. So, I don't know necessarily about action items. We may have had some, but I just don't recall because it was about 2 years ago. But, I think it was just helpful to go through these exercises. And I just thought they were very eye-opening to realize, to try to see outside your own perspective, because I think for some people, it's just really difficult to understand how people feel in certain situations, or when you're asked something some people think it's perfectly okay and just really don't understand how the other person may be interpreting that question. So that was what I recall most from the event. And it was an outside consultant, which I have to say, maybe I thought that was good. I think coming from inside, I don't know that it would have been effective. I felt like they could kind of say anything and they didn't have to worry about maybe offending people, which might have been an issue if they were trying to do it more internal. So yeah, I thought it was helpful.
And then let's see here. Jen, you mentioned Jane Elliott training blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment is a good start for basic awareness. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I was actually a teacher, I believe, and she's actually become more, people become more aware of this training experiment that she did. I believe it was in maybe 1968 or late 60s. But yeah, if you just Google her name and that experiment, it's something that's kind of like lingered on. It's like a pretty good, and you can just watch the YouTube videos for free. It's like something really easy you can share with other people. And basically she just went through a training exercise with maybe third graders and kind of decided, you know, on day one that anybody with blue eyes was a bad person, and then kind of made all of those people realize what it was like to be the better people with the brown eyes. And then the next day she traded the blue eyes to the brown eyes. And then the next day the brown eyed kids were the good people. So, but she uses this for, she has, I mean, it's translated really well into like any kind of basic business training, but, you know, just for general awareness of understanding how people feel for, you know, racial bias for no reason. So it's a good, it's a good, you know, little video. You can watch it online.
Gina, I have a question for you, actually. You mentioned some of the potential long-range effects of the pandemic on women and just on the economy overall. Do you have any suggestions for what employers can do to better accommodate and support employees, including women, as they hopefully return to work?
Sure. I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, providing an environment that's kind of, you know, welcoming to people who are going through, you know, possibly family challenges. So the couple of things that I was reading about recently was one for, especially for women who are perhaps high performers already, but are maybe saying, you know, I'm really getting burned out. I'm thinking about cutting my hours. I'm thinking about, you know, taking a leave, providing an opportunity for them to take a pandemic leave of absence. I thought that was really interesting. I read that in the Harvard Business Review the other day. Obviously, that's kind of stopping the kind of like employment gap, but I think that was an interesting suggestion. Another one for in terms of like as we move into recovery, two ideas. The one is simply removing the gap year bias. I know a lot of times when, you know, when I do hiring, I look at a resume and I see that somebody had a year or 2 years or whatever off. And, you know, sometimes it's, you know, when you interview the person, they have a really great reason, but sometimes people are looking at resumes and they won't even, you know, maybe give it, you know, they'll just kind of put it in the next pile, as opposed to kind of giving that person who has otherwise a really stellar resume an opportunity to just meet and talk about what their experience was. And I think especially with the pandemic, it'll be important to keep that in mind. The other idea is simply making sure that you have like diverse candidates. You know, the same article I just referenced, I'll try to dig it up, mentioned that, you know, if there's the more women or people of color that you have that are candidates to review, the more likely that one of them will be selected. So if you have one woman and 5 men that you're interviewing, yeah, you're like pretty like unlikely to pick the one woman for the job. So having a diverse candidate pool to begin with, and having and you know and again, like thinking about those people who might have that gap year is really important, I think.
Yeah, I've even heard the suggestion about just look, because you mentioned resumes, you know, some people will even remove some of the education pieces and the names, so they can really just look at, you know, the skills or their experience.
Yeah.